Hello and welcome. Wow, that is really loud. It is my pleasure to introduce Kirsten Vinyeta. Vinyeta, sorry. And today's my first day to meet her in person. I've met her digitally before because I was on the hiring committee that helped bring her here. And her work stood out from the moment I reviewed her application. When I was reviewing it, I was drawn to her deeply collaborative approach to research with Indigenous communities. And I also was really struck with how her work contributes to addressing different dimensions of climate justice concerns. I see her work as supporting the goals of the Karuk tribe and other tribes that she's partnered with. And she has kind of identified and helped to share this Indigenous knowledge around fire and fire management that has long been held by this tribe and suppressed for far too long. I think tomorrow's talk might focus more on fire. It's really fascinating work, though, this revival of this cultural knowledge in a way to hopefully help reduce the likelihood of catastrophic fires using cultural burns. I'm also, I really like how Dr. Vinyeta is not only an academic scientist, a sociologist, but she's also an artist and she illustrates. And I think her illustrations help to communicate beyond just academic audiences. And hopefully she'll be sharing some of those illustrations with us too. That's, again, done in collaboration with her tribal partners. So for a little background, Dr. Vinyeta is an environmental sociologist whose research focuses on the impacts of US federal land management and climate change on Indigenous peoples and sovereignty. She recently received her PhD, bravo, in environmental sciences, studies, and policy at the University of Oregon earlier this summer. And she has a Bachelor of Science in landscape architecture from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. At the University of Oregon, she was a research fellow for the Tribal Climate Change Project, and she's conducted community-based participatory research with the Coquille Indian tribe as part of her master's thesis. Since 2016, she's been a collaborating researcher and illustrator for the Karuk tribe's Department of Natural Resources. And she's examined how federal wildlife management policies affect the tribe's ability to adapt to climate change and protect the ecological integrity of the Klamath River Basin. In her own words, as a settler collaborating with Indigenous scholars, professionals, and communities, she is committed to community-based projects that honor Indigenous epistemologies and advance Indigenous sovereignty. So without further ado, I'm going to hand the microphone over to Kirsten.
Can you all hear me? Let's see. Hopefully, okay. Thank you so much to the organizers for inviting me. There was sort of a last minute cancellation and I was plugged in somewhat last minute, but I'm honored to be here. And thank you, Sarah, for that lovely introduction and very flattering introduction. And thank you all for showing up. I literally have been here for a month and I started this job officially not very long ago. And I was just a few months ago a graduate student. So I'm transitioning into my new role and here I am. So I want to open, because I'm somebody that works closely with Indigenous peoples, I want to open by grounding this conversation on the Shoshone homelands that our institution is situated upon. We have at least one Shoshone elder among us, and I'm grateful for Darren Perry's presence today. And as a settler scholar, and as Sarah started to allude to, so much of my thinking has been profoundly shaped by my collaborations with Indigenous communities and Indigenous scholars whose epistemological frameworks dissolve the divides between nature and culture. And that will certainly come through in this talk, as well as, and even more so in tomorrow's talk. So I am what they call a geriatric millennial. So if you don't mind, I'm gonna break the ice with some memes. When I looked at myself in the context of the rest of the speakers scheduled for this seminar series, I was like, oh boy, one of these is not like the others. And so I hope you know it's an act of courage for me to stand up here as a recently graduated qualitative sociologist that at times has critiqued the logics of Western science and act like some sort of authority in front of this audience. But also, I'm hoping that these conversations will get us to contemplate with renewed curiosity how our disciplines are unnecessarily siloed, and that they interact in vital ways that are key to addressing the social and ecological issues of our time. So I was asked to give this talk on the same day that I taught one of my first lectures in environmental sociology to my undergraduate class here at USU. And so this talk was in part inspired by some of the conversations that ensued with my undergraduate students. We were painstakingly talking about how for decades and decades, most mainstream sociologists conceived of human society as sort of existing in this sterile floating bubble suspended above Earth with no real environmental context to speak of. And it just seems so puzzling to my students in regard to the 70+ year delay between the establishment of sociology as a discipline in the United States and the emergence of my particular subfield, which is environmental sociology. One of my students, Ammon, said, it seems like such an obvious thing that the environment and humanity would have great impact on each other and shape each other. My question then is why it took so long for these branches of study to be formed. And indeed, Ammon, why, oh why, right? Why did it take so long? And for one, part of this can be attributed to the Western nature culture binaries that permeate Western institutions and really shape disciplinary formation. But also what I'm calling disciplinary silos and quote unquote danger zones, okay, a term that I literally made up for this presentation. So what I mean by this is the need for emerging disciplines to justify their existence by really distinguishing themselves and siloing themselves from other pre-existing disciplines. So for example, sociology emerged after many of the natural sciences. So it had to really distinguish itself by claiming like the human sphere as its predominant territory and kind of say like, no, we don't do this other stuff, right? But also these, what I'm calling these disciplinary danger zones. And what I mean by that is, for example, sociology's distancing from the natural sciences out of deep concern for the implications of social Darwinism and determinism. And then conversely, the natural sciences, and I'm speaking here broadly and obviously making generalizations, but the natural sciences distancing from anything too political that could make research seem tainted with bias. But what is it that we miss, right, when we fail to think of our research questions in the context of each other's disciplines? And what could be gained from simultaneously shining our analytical lenses onto the same socio-ecological problem, right? So not everybody, this is a very probably multidisciplinary audience, and maybe sociology is not something that everyone's entirely familiar with, other than just having heard that it exists. And so I just wanted to give a very basic overview of what sociologists do. So in essence, to give you the textbook description, sociologists study the social structures and institutions that shape human interactions, choices, and life chances for members of a given society. And what I mean here by social institutions, and again, these definitions could be disputed even among sociologists, but broadly speaking, we conceive of social institutions as things like family, right? And there's questions underneath each of these categories that kind of like characterize some of the inquiries that sociologists make. Who counts as family? Who can and can't you marry, right? What constitutes a child? Is childcare communal or the responsibility of the parents only, right? Is it a nuclear style family? Is it community based? Then there's government. Who has authority? Are decisions autocratic or democratic? What laws and regulations are instituted? Who gets to vote? So on and so forth. Economy. What are the rules of trade? What constitutes currency? Who gets to use what resources? How are resources replenished? And the list goes on. Education, what constitutes knowledge worth passing on, right? And that'll be key to tomorrow's conversation. Who can or should go to school and for how long, et cetera, et cetera. Religion, what is good and evil? What is moral? What is your responsibility in this lifetime, et cetera. And then there are hierarchical structures that are instituted in each society that sort of shape and dictate how those social institutions are going to operate, right? And these are concepts like classism, racism, patriarchy, settler colonialism, speciesism, right? Different ways of establishing hierarchies and distributing power. So then my specific subdiscipline of environmental sociology emerged following the civil rights movement and in the midst of the rise of the environmental movement, when a lot of civil rights activists kind of taught environmental activists the ropes of how to achieve big objectives through social movements. So those kind of the conversations in the civil rights sphere and in the environmental sphere started to blend, and that kind of signaled to sociologists like, oh, or at least some sociologists had already been focusing on this, which we'll talk about in a second. But in terms of environmental sociology, it kind of emerged. It was a late bloomer, and they were like, oh yeah, like environmental issues are social issues. Maybe we should think about that. And so it's basically trying to examine how the social systems I just described, right, in a very elementary fashion, but the institutions and hierarchical structures that define our society, how do they shape and are shaped by ecosystems? Okay, and that sounds really ecological at first because the word ecosystem is in there. As I'll talk about in a bit, I don't think it's gone as far as it can go yet. And that's kind of what I'm pressing forth in this conversation, is that generally we're talking about ecosystems in a very generic or elementary way. And I think it can go a step further by more collaborations between sociologists and natural scientists. So environmental sociology is among a number of active subfields that have made vital interventions to bring social and ecological analyses closer together, including rural sociology, which existed long before environmental sociology. Sociology of natural resources, same thing. In human ecology, political ecology, social ecology, and the list goes on, right? And here at USU, actually, I found out recently, this was our sociology department here was among the first to really incorporate environmental issues into their sociological scope. But it was done primarily through rural sociology and the sociology of natural resources, which continues to be a very strong part of our program here at this university. So USU was actually at the forefront of integrating these questions, albeit with like a specific scope focused more on rural spaces and rural communities. So to bring that image back and add some additional context, despite these vital interventions of these subfields that I just mentioned, which have definitely advanced the conversation, at least in like the social and interdisciplinary sciences, I find that there is a very frustrating absence of a specific type of analysis that some of us in sociology, especially those of us that work with Indigenous partners and or are Indigenous scholars, find that is still very absent. And that is, how do specific systems of oppression and social hierarchies like racism, like settler colonialism, patriarchy, capitalism, etc., shape specific, and again, specific is the key term here, specific ecosystems, species, and ecosystem processes, and then vice versa, right? How do specific ecosystems affect specific social institutions, specific communities, specific social structures? And the relative scarcity of these types of analyses occur in part because of how most sociologists frame the environment, and then in part because of how ecologists, biologists, other natural scientists frame humanity. So for example, few sociologists focus attention on spaces with little to no visible human habitation, wilderness areas, if you will, as though those ecosystems are void of sociological meaning. Yet wilderness areas in which human habitation is now prohibited by law are the product of specific colonial ideologies, and they were not always uninhabited. They represent the ancestral lands of hundreds of indigenous tribes who have interacted with, shaped, and been shaped by these landscapes since time immemorial. Such landscapes are therefore immersed in power struggles, human histories, and sociological meaning. Furthermore, when the environment is considered, which it often is, right? Like there's environmental sociologists, there's a lot of sociologists working on things pertaining to the environment. But oftentimes when it is brought up and incorporated into the analyses, it is mentioned and discussed in very generic ways. So, and that very much limits the depth of the socio-ecological analysis. So, oh, I've been told that this is, yep, there it is, okay. I've been told that's a trick that happens, makes it more interesting. So I like to use photos to illustrate this difference. Sociologists might speak just generically about the environment, like broadly with not much specificity, or perhaps they might go as far as to specify, say, a prairie, right, or a forest. And the next step to really deepen this analysis would be to name a specific prairie in a specific place with specific species, right? So in this case, a prairie that's near and dear to my heart, at the UW-Madison Arboretum, this dry prairie with, this compilation of species with its own history, social and ecological, right? So here we might look at how this dry prairie's trajectory, the abundance and distribution of the lead plant, of the staghorn sumac, of the butterfly weed, the prairie dropseed, how the presence or absence of certain ecological processes like fire, like grazing, like harvesting. How does that interact? How do those ecological metrics interact with social structures such as settler colonialism, capitalism, racism, patriarchy, and social institutions such as education, religion, government that may have shaped and have been shaped by this particular landscape. On the flip side, natural scientists tend to generalize and definitely depoliticize humanity. So generic, non-differentiated humanity, sometimes blamed in blanket fashion for harms against the natural world, versus specific groups with distinct histories, conflicts and power struggles, and distinct environmental risks and privileges. Sometimes perhaps the groups are conceptualized as different stakeholders, right? But the complex histories and relationships between these stakeholder groups is often defanged or oversimplified. It's a democratic and pluralistic view of state operations instead of the much more complicated reality, right? So in this picture on your right, Amanda Polcheese, a Lakota Sioux and Mi'kmaq woman who held up a feather in the face of the armed Canadian Mounted Police during a protest against potential fracking near LC Buktuk First Nation in New Brunswick, Canada, right? The two sides of this ecological conflict, a large fracking corporation with who knows what amount of money at their disposal, and a militarized police at their disposal, facing an indigenous community that is dealing with the effects of ongoing settler colonialism and is trying to protect ancestral landscapes, right? That is not just two sets of stakeholders. That is a very different scene and a significant power imbalance, right? And that is going to dictate ecologically what's going to unfold here. And those ecological impacts are then also going to reflect upon these communities, right? So dialectical relationship. There are, of course, exceptions in both of our respective arenas, right? And so in sociology, there's a lot of interesting work happening that's starting to really expand those disciplinary boundaries. Richard York, by day, is a political, works on political economic critiques of practically everything, but by night, he's really into animals. And he actually applies political economic and materialist Marxist frameworks onto concepts like the plight of the whales, right? And why the advent of petroleum didn't save the whales, despite what intuitively would have seemed was less of a need for whale oil. My own mentor, Kari Norgard, has worked for decades now with the Karuk tribe and connects the impacts of settler colonialism to specific ecosystem conditions in Karuk ancestral territory, and then discusses what the social impacts are of those ecological impacts. So intertwining ecology, tribal sovereignty, and culture, right? And how those kind of interact with structures like settler colonialism. And then James Fenelon, who's a Lakota sociologist, he's co-authored with Kari Norgard, as well as with Jennifer Elford, to incorporate indigenous knowledges into both environmental sociological frameworks and climate change planning. So when James and his co-authors do that, they're integrating human and more than human spheres as one, and therefore really breaking down that nature culture dualism that often permeates most Western sociological literature. And then, in biology, ecology, et cetera, there's also a lot of examples. I just recently read an article outlining an increasing trend in which climate scientists are increasingly diving into climate activism, right? And politicizing their work. I don't know if any of you have heard about Tyrone Hayes, but he's quite the phenomenon, and he came to talk at the University of Oregon when I was a student there. He's a biologist, specifically studies the effects of atrazine on amphibian endocrine systems, and was initially paid by Syngenta, the parent company, which is a European chemical company, to do this study. And when his findings didn't align with what the company wanted, they wanted him to shut that study down, but instead he stood his ground and made connections even between those impacts on amphibians and what that signifies for the increased rate of breast and other types of cancer, especially in Black communities. And as a Black scientist, he decided it was important for him to politicize his work at great personal costs. Syngenta actually pursued him and threatened his family. It's a very tragic and also courageous story. In 1985, Richard Levins and Richard Lewontin applied a Marxist dialectical framework to understand ecosystem dynamics, the relationship between ecosystem parts and the whole, between the co-determination between organism and environment, and importantly, the relationship between science and politics, right? And as biologists, they incorporated this Marxist framework to understand their own role and their own responsibilities in their ecosystems, their political responsibilities. And then more recently, fire ecologists such as Jonathan Long and Frank Lake. Frank is a Karuk Yurok descendant, but he is also a research ecologist for the Forest Service, have integrated the politics of indigenous settler colonial tensions to the study of wildfire management. And surely you all might be working on your own projects and maybe can think of additional examples, and I definitely would welcome hearing what you all have to say when I'm done, and you can ask questions and make comments. So there are many salient and important ways in which the integration of our disciplines can bring about more nuanced deep understanding and therefore more holistic solutions. And there are so many pressing and rich ways in which we can integrate our understanding of ecosystem structure and function, and the ways these continuously interact with the stratifying structures of society. And so I want to offer some perhaps obvious examples, but ones that really generate important questions that I feel have yet to be fully addressed. And you'll notice that instead of posing firm statements, I'll be posing a lot of questions. My 5-year-old daughter actually just learned how to use a question mark at school. It was really cute. She like came home, she's like just intonating upward at the end of every statement. She's like, that's what that's for. I'm like, uh-huh. So she would be, able to practice that repeatedly here throughout this talk. So you'll hear a lot of questions now, which means this is, something I'm contemplating and not something that is like my field of expertise yet. So this is a picture of, maybe familiar to you, of Trump's Mexico-US border wall from an MSNBC article by Julio Ricardo Varela, and is titled, "Trump's border wall was never just about security. It's meant to remind all Latinos that we're unwelcome." So how does this national project, replete with racist and classist intent, replete with social exclusion, shape the ecosystems in its midst? And so this is my cover image, and this dead mule deer that is basically symbolic of the ecosystems that have been dismembered by the US-Mexico border wall. Systems of power that oppress specific groups of people don't just happen in a vacuum above Earth. They actually bear marks upon the landscape, and they have ecological implications. And so among the many predicted impacts, and this is terrible resolution, so I'm sorry for that, but you get the general gist, are the possible effects upon, say, jaguars, whose measured corridors in green, cross the border, much like the pre-existing indigenous communities in these areas whose lands were internationally divided after conquest, and now find half of the community perhaps on one side of the border and the other half on the other. Here are some of the species whose range might be impacted by this physical structure that is really the embodiment of a socially constructed line of difference, a line on a map and in the imaginaries of many Americans that then become a physical barrier on the landscape. So how might the impaired movement of these species affect not just these species in particular, but overall ecosystem health, right? You guys know these things far more than me, how these questions are all interrelated. And then how might the resulting ecological decline then further affect specific human cultures that are already affected by the border wall, right? In economic, political, and social ways. Or this photo, capturing the genocidal violence resulting in the decimation of thousands and eventually millions of bison, settler colonial violence in the name of manifest destiny, all but eradicated a fundamental keystone species, the disappearance of which has caused a series of cascading ecological and social impacts that reverberate to this day. And these are colonial ecologies being violently imposed upon indigenous territories, and the ecological impacts can't be fully understood without understanding the logics of settler colonialism, capitalism, and the privatization of land, which are all interrelated systems. And conversely, the restoration of bison to some of its historical range by different tribal entities is as much a political and spiritual act as it is an ecological act, and they must be understood in synchrony. Again, poor resolution, but another example. What are the institutional and structural forces that create a society in which most people can name each and every corporate logo on the left, but can't even begin to guess the names of any of the plants on the right? How have capitalist values shaped our education systems and media to glorify branding and corporatization and erase the importance of the species and landscapes we depend on. To bring in some Marxist theory, how has Marxist concept of worker alienation, in which workers are separated from their environment, from their own creativity, from themselves, from their families, how does that factor into this and create a world in which most people barely know the biotic communities in their midst because they're busy working wage labor and don't have the opportunity really or the educational measures to become familiar with their biotic communities? And what are the impacts of all this on specific ecosystems and species? When folks don't realize a species or ecosystem exists, they can't possibly care or notice when it goes missing, right? And so increasingly, people are not familiar with specific species or ecosystems or their functionings. And we're facing some significant ecological and social crises that really require for folks to care and know. So what is the impact also on mental health, group identities, and social well-being when connections to local ecosystems are eroded in this way? And has this erosion led to apathy that seems to permeate a lot of sectors of society around issues like climate change? And finally, one more example. What happens socially and ecologically when cultural assimilation through things like boarding schools that Indigenous peoples were subject to, but even assimilation more broadly for every child that goes to a public school and decisions are made about what's going to be taught and what's not. But specifically, when cultural assimilation breaks the continuity of languages that are place-based, skills and knowledges that are deeply tied to specific landscapes, what happens then, right? Here's a partial list. When I was working with the Karuk at one point, I was doing these species profiles and I was asked to find the Karuk words for the different species, right? So we could incorporate them into this report. And when I looked up, and there's this really neat digital dictionary that Berkeley has put together with a Karuk dictionary. So I went on there and I typed salmon and like dozens of words related to salmon popped up. This is just this isn't even all of them. This is just what fit on the screen. So for those of you that aren't super familiar with Pacific Northwest tribes, a lot of the tribes in the Pacific Northwest have a deep connection to salmon, both from a subsistence and spiritual standpoint. The Karuk are no different. They're about to actually dismantle, in theory, the 4 dams that are blocking the Klamath River. So it's going to be a huge project that may return some health to the riparian system there that's really stressed right now. And so salmon and salmon-related activism is huge in Karuk country. And in a culture in which there is a specific word for, and I quote, juice from joints of salmon backbone and whole salmon before being cut up, this type of culture has clearly coexisted with salmon in deeply important ways for a long time and is intimately familiar with salmon ecologies, right? So what are the ecological losses associated with language assimilation, boarding schools, Karuk incorporation into capitalist wage labor? And how do these social changes affect Karuk spirituality, health, and political sovereignty? So there are really endless, exciting ways in which sociological frameworks aimed at dissecting social injustice could be integrated with the natural sciences to produce groundbreaking research. And perhaps some of you are already engaged in this interdisciplinary work. And I would love to hear about that if there's time. But here are some questions I find particularly compelling as an environmental sociologist that has worked with and for tribes now for some time and is broadly interested in ecological restoration and social justice. Why do specific non-human species coexist with specific ethnic, racial, or gendered social groups? Can we develop interspecies social networks to understand how different groups of people are associated with different ecological palettes? Are specific land management boundaries imbued with distinct institutional values and structural hierarchies? And if so, how do those affect the ecological composition and processes within? How are the ecologies of landscapes marked by acute settler colonial racist or gendered violence distinct from landscapes devoid of this acute history? How does the attainment of social justice affect the ecosystems in which justice has been attained? And finally, how can we track oppressive and liberatory historical events to specific ecological changes on the landscape? How do other species factor into liberation and oppression? So in sum, when I was asked to give a talk about something I care about that might be relevant to the Ecology Center, I decided I wanted to openly manifest this dream of integrating ecological data with sociological data in ways that largely remain underrepresented in my field and probably in your fields as well. So I end with this affirmation: natural and social scientists have the power and prerogative to genuinely collaborate in meaningful ways that produce novel research and that generate solutions that simultaneously restore ecological health and advance social justice. And I'm really hoping that my own unfurling journey will be dappled with these kinds of pursuits. And so tomorrow, if you're interested, I invite you to join me to hear a bit about my dissertation research in partnership with the Karuk Tribe Department of Natural Resources, in which I examine the role of settler colonialism in producing California's wildfire crisis, and also to hear a bit, like Sarah was mentioning, about how I bridge sociology and ecology in a pretty elementary way, I would say, but via, of all things, digital illustration work for the tribe. So tomorrow we'll get even more fringe with some humanities stuff. So with that, I will open it up for questions, and thank you all so much for listening. And yeah.